You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. Have you ever wanted to have big fish in your pond, in your farm pond? What do you got to do to have that? We're going to find out today talking with Wes Neal, Research and Extension Professor at Mississippi State University.
Mississippi Outdoors is sponsored by Entergy Mississippi. Entergy is building a stronger and cleaner grid to power a brighter future and protect our great outdoors for generations to come.
You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. Do you own a pond on your property? You have one, you know someone that does. Well, what about managing that pond so that you can catch fish out of it, maybe even year round? Somebody who knows all about it, Wes Neal, Extension and Research Professor at Mississippi State University. Wes, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here, Matt.
And before we jump into fisheries and the details, Extension and Research Professor, I know what a professor is, but the extension and research part of it, what goes into that for you?
Sure. The Cooperative Extension Program is a nationwide program that's funded nationally, but it comes through the state, and every state has their own program, and ours is housed at Mississippi State University. And essentially, we take research information and make sure it's palatable to the landowner. Okay. Basically, we help people live better.
Okay.
The research part of it, I do research on the side. It's not necessarily my main job, but it's part I enjoy.
Okay. Now, how'd you wind up at Mississippi State?
I was actually stolen from another university. I was at the University of Arkansas Pine Bluff as their research and extension specialist, and was sniped by faculty at Mississippi State about 17 or 18 years ago.
Okay. So, now, when you say stolen, you don't mean like middle of the night, van pulls up, they grab you, throw you in, and drive to Starkville, do you?
I mean, several fisheries professors showed up at a conference with me, and they walked up to my colleagues and said, "We're stealing Wes Neal. We just want you to know that."
And did I read you're actually originally from Virginia?
Yeah, born and raised in the Appalachian Mountains.
Okay.
Went to Virginia Tech as an undergrad, went off and did my master's and PhD in North Carolina, and then spent some time overseas, overseas, I guess, in the Caribbean. So
oh, wow.
Kind of lived all around the South, even the Deep South, which if you consider Puerto Rico the Deep South.
Yeah, so. Sure. Well, and so somewhere along the way, I'm assuming fisheries sort of became a passion for you. What's your story there?
Yeah, well, like so many of us, I always liked to fish and hunt. And I picked my college like every other student picks their college. I followed my friends, decided to go into engineering because that seemed like the thing to do. And after about a semester of engineering, I said, I don't like this. And I said, I really don't like this. I'm doing okay. I don't enjoy it, but what do I want to do? And I got the course catalog and started flipping through it, and I came to fishery science, and I'm like, you can do that? And I changed my major right away, got a new advisor, walked into my new advisor, and he says, "Why do you want to be in fisheries?" And I said, "Well, I've always loved to fish. I've always loved to hunt." He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Become an anesthesiologist. You'll make a lot more money and you'll have a lot more free time to fish and hunt." I didn't listen to him, and the rest is history. So.
Yeah, and so now you're helping, as you said, others to have those fishing experiences, their own, bodies of water and that sort of thing. What let's say here in the spring in Mississippi, what's a typical experience like for you in working with a landowner, pond owner, to manage that fishery?
Sure. It starts getting real busy right about now. As soon as the red buds are starting to bloom right now, the dogwoods will be out soon. This is the time of year everybody starts thinking about their ponds. I love the fall. I'm a deer hunter too, and I love the fall because nobody thinks about ponds. Everybody's thinking about the deer woods, the food plots, and that's my time off. But right now it gets really, really busy. It starts off usually about February. I start getting calls about fish kills due to water chemistry problems. About March or April, the plants and weeds start to take off, and I have lots of weed calls. I bet you 50% of my calls are, what weed is this and how do I kill it? And then by midsummer, it's oftentimes, fish kills, oxygen-related fish kills. And of course, the big one in Mississippi is, why are my bass so small? And we can get into that in a little bit.
Sure. Okay, so let's do that.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back. You mentioned February, for example, situations, fish kills, you get calls about that. So give me sort of layman's version of that scenario you run into.
Sure, because that's a big one. What you'll find here a lot of times is people will call you and say, my fish are dying. And almost always they think somebody's poisoned my fish. Chances are no one's ever poisoned your fish. It would take so much chemical to pour into a pond to kill your fish that you'd see them pull up with a big truck. The reality is fish usually die for a number of reasons, and those reasons vary depending on the time of year and the conditions. If I'm seeing fish dying in December, January, February, early March, it's a few fish a day, every day. There's all species, all sizes. They have visible signs like sores on their body or eroded fins. That's almost always water chemistry.
Okay.
We say happy water, happy fish. If your pond is low in alkalinity, which is the buffering capacity of the water, it's what controls pH, then your fish can get stressed out and then get sick from other diseases. It's just like a garden. If your garden's if you've got an acidic garden, what do you do to it?
I don't know.
You lime it, right?
I call you. Yeah.
You lime your garden, right?
Right.
If you've got too much of an acid, the same things for the pond. Ponds that are low in alkalinity means they're low in lime. That means they're having wild pH swings and fish are getting stressed out. So the solution is adding good old-fashioned crushed up limestone rock to the pond, and that fixes the problem.
Okay.
As you move into the summer, the problems start to become more oxygen related, and that's a little bit more difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can be what's called a spring turnover, which that's usually going to be about May or April to June when you have these big, strong thunderstorms come in. It gets cloudy, photosynthesis sort of goes down for a while, and then you get this heavy, cold rain that mixes the pond up, and it basically brings all that anoxic water that builds up down deep up with the water that should have oxygen in it up top, and you suck all the oxygen out and all the fish die. That's usually a complete kill or nearly a complete kill. It's pretty dramatic for everybody involved. And then later in the summer, we just see oxygen depressions where it just gets too hot, oxygen levels drop overnight, and some fish die, not necessarily all fish.
Okay. Is that the scenario? I hear people use the term a pond turned over,
Yep.
or it's turning over in the summer. That's what you're talking
That's usually May to June, usually associated with some kind of weather event. Ponds don't just usually turn over on their own. They do. They naturally turn over every year. They start turning over in the fall, and they turn over all winter long into the spring until they start to stratify again. But that's usually a gradual process, doesn't kill the fish. What goes bad, when it all goes bad, is when you've had plenty of stratification in the pond. Down deep, you get this layer of low oxygen water, and then you get the upper layers, which should have oxygen in them. They start to go down in oxygen because of the overcast weather, and then you get this event that causes the whole pond to mix up. You bring that low oxygen water up, and it basically, the oxygen gets too low for the fish.
for them to survive.
Yep.
It's fascinating, and I think it would be fascinating for most to really have a chance to sit down and kind of have someone like you explain that.
Yeah.
All right. You mentioned the pH level or the chemistry of the water, as you were saying that, talking about the early spring or wintertime deal, I couldn't help but think of a fish bowl. As a kid, we have the goldfish in the tank, the fish tank. And even in that, we're always kind of, you have to test the water and see what color it gives you in the test. And that's what you put this chemical in or whatever to make it. So in other words, I guess what I'm saying is it's almost like the pond is just a giant fish bowl. Same thing.
It is. And that's actually a great example, because if you've ever gone to a county fair and won a goldfish at some competition and brought it home and you say, Mom, I need water. And she said, well, here's a jug of water. And she poured the water in a bowl and it's distilled water.
Yeah.
What's going to happen to the fish? It's going to die.
Yeah.
This always surprises people when I tell them this, but fish cannot live in pure water. They cannot survive in pure water. It has nothing dissolved in it, no salts, no minerals, nothing. What happens, fish are kind of like, they're like us, but they also have a more direct connection to their environment. So they breathe through their gills, right? Mm-hmm. Well, their gills are very thin. They're designed to let oxygen come in and other gases come out. Well, they also let salts come in and out. And if you're a fish and you're out in water that has extremely low chemistry or low alkalinity, then all the salt in your body wants to leave, and all the water in the pond wants to come in, because through simple diffusion, it wants to equilibrate those concentrations. And the fish is constantly fighting this battle of too much water coming into its body and too much salt leaving its body. And that stress causes it to get sick from other things. It just gets stressed out and it gets a cold. And those colds can kill it.
Okay. So again, my mind was racing as you're talking about salinity, because, okay, there's a thing called brackish water.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we go down in Louisiana or the coast, we find areas where the fresh water and the salt water mix. And in that brackish area, freshwater species like a largemouth bass can live just fine in it, right? In that brackish water.
Up to a point, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It's interesting, some species are much more tolerant of some salinity than others. In fact, one thing we've found when we're hauling fish around, like when your state agency goes out and stocks a lake, they'll often add salt to the tank because that brings the water up to the same chemistry as what's inside the fish. Okay. So they're not experiencing that stress as much. Now, there's some species which can move between salt water and fresh water, and that requires special adaptation. But if you take a freshwater fish and throw it in salt water, usually it turns belly up. And if you take a saltwater fish and throw it in fresh water, the same thing. Yeah. Interesting story, too. When people talk about, you've heard the term, I'm sure, drink like a fish.
Yes.
Well, which fish drink? Think about that for a second.
Drink, yeah.
Yeah, if you're a fish and you're living in fresh water where you have saltier blood than the water, and water's always coming in, you don't need to drink.
Right.
You don't drink as a freshwater fisher. What you do is you pee a lot. So pee like a fish would be more accurate for freshwater fish. Saltwater fish, on the other hand, their blood is less salty than their environment. So they do drink and have to pump out the excess salt to keep water in their body. So when someone says drink like a fish, say which kind? Because they mean saltwater.
Saltwater fish. Very cool. Again, I want to go back to, you mentioned later in the spring, like right about now, there's a lot of vegetation questions and problems that you get with pond owners and pond management. Warms up, sun's out, up comes, I guess, algae,
all
pond
kinds
vegetation.
Of stuff. Yeah, many species. We just wrote a book, and I think we've got 48 groups or species in that book that are common pond problems, and there's plenty more.
Okay. So again, on the outside looking in, I've never had a pond myself. I'm just the guy who shows up when they invite me and try to catch fish, But grass carp, I'd always heard, well, okay, the natural solution there is just, if you got the right number of grass carp, they'll do their job. I'm assuming it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, well, grass carp are great if you want them. I mean, they introduce their own set of issues, but they're great for preventing weed problems. So you can stock them at low densities when you first stock the pond. 3 to 5 per acre is usually plenty.
Okay.
And that density of fish will keep weeds from becoming established. But once weeds become established, like if you get a pond full of southern naiad or hydrilla or species like that, you need so many grass carp, 30, 40, 50 per acre, to control those weeds that the carp themselves become a problem. So they're great as a prevention. They're not nearly as good as a control by themselves. Now, if you do some sort of what we call an integrated approach where you herbicide the lake, then you put in grass carp, they can be very effective.
Okay, herbicide the lake. Good, bad, does it have, like medication? Are there side effects? What do you...
We only have a handful of aquatic approved herbicides. If you go to the terrestrial side, there's hundreds and hundreds of things you can spray on forests and plants, on crops and so forth. But I can't remember the exact number. I want to say it's 17 or 18 registered aquatic herbicides. All are considered relatively safe. They all break down pretty quickly. And they're relatively species specific. So you really need to identify what you have before you select an herbicide. You can't just run down to the co-op and say, give me an aquatic herbicide and take it out to your pond, because it might not work on the species you have, or it may not work under the conditions you have. Some of them are pH dependent, for example. I think it's flumioxazin that if you use it in a pond that has a pH above 8.5, I think it lasts for about 20 minutes.
Okay.
So it's gone pretty quick. It's not going to be effective at that. It breaks down too quick. So you need to know a little bit more about the plant species that you're trying to control and your pond before you select the right herbicide. But they're safe. The biggest problem with herbicides is when you put them in there, they're going to kill the plants. At least you hope they're going to kill the plants. And if those plants die fast, when plants decompose, they use up oxygen. You run the risk of an oxygen kill because of treating the weeds. So something you need to think about and prepare for.
Yeah. What's maybe the most popular type of fish / fishing that people want in their private ponds in Mississippi?
Oh, I would say largemouth bass is the most popular.
Okay.
Surprisingly, a second that I get the calls on most is crappie.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
Like I had an extension agent call me just this week and say, "What's the proper stocking density for crappie in a 1 acre pond?" And my response was, "Oh, that's easy, 0. Don't put crappie in ponds."
Okay, why not?
They overpopulate. They have extremely erratic reproduction, which means that tomorrow or this year they won't spawn at all, and next year they'll fill the pond up. You just never know what's going to happen. And once they spawn and they spawn like crazy, they compete with bass and they compete with the bluegill. So they're competing with your predator and your prey, and you end up with a pond full of small, stunted fish of all sizes and species.
I've always wondered that because you run into plenty of the situations where there's a pond that's being managed for big largemouth bass, depending on the size. And it seemed like, again, perception was that always coincided with, they also have great big bluegill and copper nose and, shell cracker that are in that same body of water. But you never did seem to run into a place where, this is a stock pond with crappie, and I guess there's your answer.
Yeah. Well, yeah, crappie will mess it up, but you actually said something I wanted to correct.
Okay.
And that is, you don't usually find big bass and big bluegill together
in the same pond.
It's really, think of it as a spectrum. You can have really big bass, but you need lots of small bluegill, or you can have really big bluegill, but you need lots of small bass, because the way it works is, in order to have lots of bass, you need to have a few bass that have unlimited prey. And in order to have really big bluegill, you need to have few bluegill that have unlimited prey. And the way you get that is either through predation, by having lots of little bass eating the bluegill, or through bluegill crowding, which means lots of baby bluegill are out there for the bass to eat. So a lot of people want everything from their pond, and that's something we should mention is when you buy a pond, build a pond, or otherwise try to manage a pond, the very first thing you should do is figure out, what do you want from the pond? And keep in mind, you can't have everything.
Yeah.
You need to pick an objective, stick with that objective, and understand that you're going to have to sacrifice some things. So like the trophy bass, if you want to grow great big bass in your pond, chances are you're not going to be catching big slab bluegill. Okay. If you want big slab bluegill, you're going to probably need to let those bass go to more of a overcrowded small bass population to promote big bluegill. So just keep that in mind, as you can't have, one pond can't be everything.
And I guess since it's not, 100% controllable, you still may have a big fish, in that bluegill pond per se. It's just not going to have a bunch of them.
Yeah. Some of the biggest bass I've ever caught came from bass crowded ponds, because you get that one bass it has the genetics. There's 4 things that control fish. I'm sure you've had some deer people on here and talked about the 3 things that control deer.
Yes.
And it's genetics, food, and age, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fish have one more, and that's water temperature.
Okay.
Because they're cold-blooded. Their growth is dependent on the temperature of their environment. So they're like deer. And actually, my first podcast I ever did on my show was with a deer guy, and it was called Bass R Bucks, because we manage them almost the same. We manage for genetics. We manage for food. We manage for age. With fish, we also manage for water temperature. Well, if you own a pond in Mississippi or Minnesota, you can't really control water temperature, so we don't manage for it. But with the bass, genetics, once you stocked it, you got the genetics you have. Age, well, you don't want every single bass to grow up. The way I like to think about it is, let's say a pond can support 100 pounds per acre. Well, that could be 10 10-pound bass.
Okay.
Or that could be 101-pound bass, or that could be some combination, but it can only support 100 pounds per acre. So if you get rid of all those little bass and only a handful of bass remain that are female, because only females get big, and a little bit bigger fish, then you're more likely for those fish to grow faster, have all the food in the world, and grow big. So we don't really manage for water temperature. We don't really manage for genetics once we've stocked it, and we certainly don't really manage for age, because we don't want every bass growing up. And that's the biggest mistake I see in Mississippi is people just won't take bass out of their ponds.
Yeah. Chip, you got a question?
I'm fascinated listening to this conversation because growing up, my grandparents, they just had catfish ponds. And you're talking about putting crappie in your ponds and bass in your ponds. How much easier is it to manage catfish? It sounds way harder to manage those than it is to just have catfish pond.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can do catfish ponds as well. In fact, for smaller ponds, usually we don't manage bass bluegill ponds very effectively for ponds that are less than about an acre in size. Those smaller ponds, we try to seek out other options, and catfish are a great option. However, catfish will reproduce in ponds and they will overpopulate. So you need to have a predator in with them to prevent them from overpopulating. So catfish ponds, usually when people start them off, they stock the pond with catfish, 100 per acre, or maybe more if they want to feed them. And then they'll put bass in as well. And the bass's sole job is to eat baby catfish. When the baby catfish are born, the bass's job is to eat them so that they don't overpopulate. Problem with that is bass are eating all the baby catfish. So once your catfish get larger and you start catching them out, once you've taken out 50, 60% of the catfish, it's a good idea to stock more. And at that point in time, you need to stock bigger catfish because otherwise you're going to stock little fish to the bass and the bass are just going to eat them. So,
I think in that scenario, we were probably the predators because I felt like when we lived near my grandparents, we ate catfish every single night.
Which is not necessarily a bad thing.
No.
If you're like me, you enjoy fried catfish and other kinds. It's interesting. So you mentioned managing those, numbers as far as how many you catch. A pond owner, almost like a deer hunter, is keeping tabs on and records and data on, what they harvest on their land.
I hope so. Most of them don't, but I encourage them to. Yes.
Right. And I've heard that people sitting in your chair a bunch encouraging, you can't manage what you don't measure. Similar for pond owners, like should they be keeping up with what's coming out and being kept and what the catches are?
Absolutely. In fact, I tell people one of the best ideas I ever saw was one of our retired faculty members. I went to his pond one time and he had a mailbox beside the pond. I mean, literally a mailbox on a stake right beside the edge of the pond. And inside of that mailbox, he kept a logbook. He kept a measuring board. He kept several pencils, and he kept a bottle of bourbon. And I asked him what the bottle of bourbon was for, and he says to encourage reporting. So that's a great idea. Every time you fish a pond, you need to record what you caught. You don't need to get real specific. I mean, you don't need to measure it down to the 1/16 of an inch. But if you say, I went out today and I caught 17 fish and 10 of them were under 13 inches and I kept them, and 7 of them were greater than 13 inches and I released them, at the end of the year, you'll have a pretty good idea if you're meeting your harvest recommendations for the pond. Because remember, you need to take bass out. You absolutely need to be harvesting out bass. And if it's an unfertilized pond, 15 pounds per acre per year minimum. And for a fertilized pond, you need to double that. So 30 pounds of bass per acre per year. If you've got a 10-acre pond, that's 300 pounds of bass. Keeping records is a good way to know if you got there or not.
Okay. So you've touched on that a couple of times now, the importance of, say, we're going to have a bass pond, the importance of catching fish out of that pond, not totally catch and release. So what are the rules, the steadfast rules for pond owners that you try to communicate to those pond owners?
Sure. I've done hundreds of pond workshops, and every single one of them, I start off the same. It's the 3 golden rules of pond management. And they're super simple. They're easy to remember. It's build it right, stock it right, fish it right. Those are the 3 things you need to keep in mind. Now, not everybody gets a chance to build their pond. Maybe you bought your pond. Maybe it's an old pond on some family property. But if a pond is constructed right in the beginning, you'll have fewer problems. Things like don't make it too deep, don't make it too shallow. And we can get into all that if you want, but we want ponds to drop off to about 3 foot pretty quickly because shallow water promotes weeds. Okay. When you make it too deep, you get too much anoxic water, which can cause a fish kill. Make sure you've designed the dam to handle flooding in a spillway that can keep the pond level up. Make sure you use the right amount of clay, all these things that go into building a pond. Stocking it right means starting it off correctly. I don't know how many times I get a call from somebody and says, yeah, I went over to Grenada Lake, I caught some crappie, then I went over to Ross Barnett and I pulled out some bass and threw them all in there. First of all, when you dump an 8-pound bass in a pond, chances are it's going to do terrible. It's not evolved for that pond. It hasn't grown up in that pond. You've thrown it in there. I once had a great story from a guy that had more money than God. And he said, I wanted a pond and I didn't have a good site for it, but I had the money. So I built the pond. And, it was just like a half moon on the side of a hill. And he said, I'm 82 years old. I don't buy green bananas because I might not be here when they get ripe. So I wanted the big fish in there right away. So he paid this consultant to go out and buy him some big fish. And he went to this guy in Texas and he said, hey, would you sell me 3 12-pound bass? And the guy's like, no. So he came back to the guy and said, oh, he won't sell his 12-pound bass. And the guy said, well, did you money whip him? So he went back to him and says, would you take $500 a piece for those 12-pound bass? And the guy took it, put them in the lake. This old man never caught one of those bass ever, but they did electrofish the pond periodically. And when they did, one of those 12-pounders was 7 pounds and the other one they never saw again because those bass weren't evolved from that pond. They didn't grow up in that pond. They knew how to make a living where they came from, but they didn't know how to make a living in that pond. So you don't want to go out and get random fish from the wild, even if you think you're putting bigger fish in there. Not only are they not going to do well because they don't know how to make a living there, but you might introduce diseases. You might also be not as good at identification as you think. I don't know how many times. I'm not going to talk about which state agency it was, but I went out and sampled one of their ponds that they stocked from their state hatchery. And I said, you guys realize that you stocked spotted bass, right?
Oh, goodness.
And they're like, no, they're not spotted, but yeah, these are spotted bass from their hatchery. So it's a good idea to go to a reputable sport fish hatchery that test their fish for diseases, stock them at very, very small sizes, fingerling sizes, so that the ones that can do well will do well, and then take out the rest.
Okay, and for those listening that might wonder, am I right? Spotted bass, like, Bay Springs, Pickwick, deep, cold water, totally different type of fish.
Not pond fish.
Not
exactly.
pond fish.
Not exactly. In fact, a lot of people, we can do a whole episode on this, the number of bass species has really increased recently. Folks don't realize that. When I grew up, there was largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass, and then there was like 1 or 2 weird ones that were isolated in places. We're now at 14 species of black bass.
Really?
Alabama bass is a new one that was split from the spotted bass. The largemouth is now 2 separate species. We used to talk about Florida bass and northern bass. Well, now it's Florida bass and largemouth bass. They're separate species now. Smallmouth may be split into 4 species. It's 2 right now, but it might be 4. So things are changing, but you want to make sure you just use good old-fashioned largemouth bass or Florida bass in the pond, not anything else, because they're not going to do nearly as well.
So is that just like a new discovery? Were they always out there and we didn't realize it? Or
we didn't know that they were separate species. Genetics is a tool that's really enabled us to see, hey, wait a second, these things are genetically distinct and isolated, which are the 2 things that are really important.
Can they interbreed?
Some can. In fact, that's been a big problem. Alabama bass have been introduced all over the Southeast, and they're causing problems with a lot of these other species.
So smallmouth, what did you say? There are multiple now?
Yeah, smallmouth bass has been split into 2 for now. The Neosho bass, which is isolated in Arkansas and Missouri and Oklahoma, I think.
Okay.
And the regular smallmouth bass that's pretty much everywhere. But there's 2 potential other species in Arkansas and maybe Oklahoma, but they may or may not even exist anymore because of all the introductions we've done with smallmouth bass.
How about that? And smallmouth also, like spotted, they're not pond fish at all.
No, I've caught them out of ponds in more northern habitats where they've done okay. They just don't thrive.
Really interesting. Okay, so it does. You've used that phrase a couple of times. If we could do a whole episode, sounds like we need to do a whole episode on building a pond.
Sure.
And then another one on stocking the pond, and then the other on how to fish it.
Yep. And the fishing, we didn't talk about that too much. That's really where people fail. That's what surprises me the most is, people are usually follow directions when it comes to building a pond because we have lots of good information out there. We just finished a new edition of a book with NRCS, Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries and Parks, and Extension. Our new pond management guide is out now. That tells you how to build a pond, tells you how to put in water control structures. It doesn't get into detail in the engineering, but it tells you everything you need to think about. It really tells you about stocking, gives you stocking rates and timing. It's important when you put fish in. Put in the prey in the fall so they have time to grow over the winter and then reproduce in the spring when the bass go in to make food for the bass. But people fail when it comes to fishing the pond. And I think it's because they spent so much money on those fish, and they're their fin friends. I put these fish out here, they're my buddies. And when I catch one, the last thing I'd want to do is kill it. But that's what you've got to do, because I don't know how many times a year I get a call and says, my bass are all small. Why? And because you didn't keep fish. You need to take out every little bass, 13 inches and under once after about 2 or 3 years after you stocked, take out, pretty much every little bass you catch under 13 inches and let the intermediate sized fish grow, and you'll have much better success.
Yeah. So. Really, really interesting stuff. Thanks for coming by and sharing a little bit of that with us. And we will have you back.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did too. Thank you so much. Wes Neal, Extension and Research Professor at Mississippi State University. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you outdoors.